Hey team, I've got Isaac from Orange County, California on the show today, and welcome to the experience with Rehman Cee, where we talk to real people about real stories on real life. And guys, it's about getting perspective. It's about getting perspective on the human condition, and it's about getting perspective on life. What is life? What is the meaning of life? And what are our frames of reasoning? How do we calculate? How do we compute? How do we navigate our journey? And to help us answer those questions, coming on the show. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the experience with Rehman Cee. Isaac, how are you, brother?
Good to see you. How are you doing?
I'm awesome. It's great to see you.
Great.
You're in beautiful California.
Yeah,
Brother, we're going to just jump straight in. My
cool.
question to you
Mhm.
is, what's your message to the world?
My message. I don't know. Off the top of my head, I would say that life is a lot more simple than we think it is, even in its complexity. And when we recognize that, it gets easier. And to kind of briefly illustrate what I mean, I feel like I'm not thinking, I can't think of the exact quote off the top of my head, but there's a quote, I think, by Joseph Campbell, who we've talked about in our clubhouse rooms. But it says, like, where you're afraid to go is where your treasure is. And so for most people that are like seeking for so many things in life, like we talk about, it's just there where they might have been avoiding something. It might be a relationship that they've been avoiding, or it might be just avoiding to uh, just some complex issue in life. And so life is a little more simple than we think it is. It might be complicated in certain details, but um, yeah, so that's like the the main thing. I think it might be complex in details, but life gives us like simplistic opportunities constantly that if we engage with them, it unfolds to us. So there you go.
And this message to the
Mhm.
world, um, this is based on your readings, or is this based on life experience, or is this, uh, a mystic came up to you and told you the message to the world?
I would say it's both. From my life experience, I would say that I had a lot of times where I tried to make things super complicated because I was avoiding something really simple, like have a difficult conversation with my partner, or engage with my work a little bit more deeply and directly, or um, the simple things that we have challenges with regularly. And because I might have been avoiding those type of things, I would try to make it a lot more complicated. And then when I got into um, searching for for answers as to why things weren't going as well as I thought they should, or that type of thing, then yeah, I found the complexity of life led back to its own simplicity, which is as complicated as things might be. Like I said, it unfolds in a way that just gives people simple opportunities that we might avoid because and the reason usually is, especially in our sort of like modern or postmodern culture, is just because the the right thing to do is usually challenging. Like it might be something simple, like calling our parents, or just simple conversations, or engaging with our work a little bit deeper, or maybe we need to go back to school and engage in our career a little bit differently. But the the real answers to, or like I should say, the like most important answers to life are usually a lot more simple than we lay them out to be. And to answer your question, I would say it's both. It's from life experience and from a lot of study that I've done.
Awesome. So let's find out a little bit more about you,
Sure.
Isaac. Where were you born? Are you the eldest, the youngest, and mum and dad? Who are they?
Um, hmm. I was born in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, kind of like boring area in the Midwest. Um, I am, depending on how you look at it, I am, for simplicity's sake, I'll say I'm number 4 of 6, but I'm also number 1 of 3 because basically my mom had 3 with her first marriage, and then with my dad, I'm the oldest. Um, so that's that. And then my parents were basically blue collar workers, you might say. My mom, I guess, mainly was a school bus driver. My dad was um, he was like a repair person for appliances. But they were both kind of so they were like of the boomer generation, and they were both kind of like opposite type of hippies. And in so doing, like my mom was so in the Christian spirituality, and my dad kind of was, but more in like the psychedelic, Grateful Dead head kind of world. And so what was interesting is me being kind of in the middle of those influences, like the atheistic sort of got to have all the answers, but at the same time, my dad letting supporting my mom, giving me the sort of meaning and community that came with the church experience. Um, I was always kind of like balancing those worldviews in my head. And my dad went to, it was kind of interesting because he got the blue collar background basically, but he went to school for psychology. And so psychology to me was always super interesting, but it was also kind of weird at the same time because up until recently, it was just kind of perceived as this uh, so, something you couldn't make a good career out of, and a lot of other things like that. Even my dad today, as I've gotten more into studying psychology, he's kind of like, well, you can't get a very good job with that because that was his experience. Um, and then, so on the other hand, my mom getting me very involved in the church from a very young age as a child had that influence. But being in a big sort of little bit chaotic family, my older siblings had a lot of issues with getting involved in the wrong circles, we'll say, getting involved in some of them into drugs and those kind of things. And then that caused me to, I guess, want to avoid those kind of things, seeing the negative effects of things like that, the wrong circles, drugs, etc. And so I got more involved in the church when I was young, partly for that reason. But then what was interesting, I think, is that some people will look at a story kind of like that and think, okay, your parents made you become involved in church or spirituality or whatever. But it was actually more like I made them do it, or at least made my mom and some of my siblings do it, because there was a lot of turmoil in the house growing up, just with those kind of things. And the religious element, we'll say, brought a big amount of stability. And then that kind of set my life on a course for at least the first decade or so of my adult life, where I was pretty heavily involved in very spiritual, very conservative church. And anyway, that's another story. But that should answer your first question
We're
or
here
two.
to hear
Yeah.
your story.
Yeah. So, yeah, so there it is for that question. But yeah.
Talk to me about the difference in personalities of your parents. How are they different?
Hmm. Interesting question. Yeah, that's an interesting question. The personalities, because it's kind of like my mom was a introverted extrovert and my dad was an extroverted introvert, if that makes any sense. In other words, they were both kind of social and but in different ways, and they were both kind of kept to themselves in different ways. And then it's weird because even from a very young age, and even though they weren't like spiritual leaders or gurus necessarily, my parents and even sometimes my grandmother, when I would spend time with her, would have would just kind of like open up to me with like um, random deep spiritual insights, like my mom just about Bible principles, and then my dad, I would be out in the Midwest we have regular thunder and lightning storms, and so he would kind of explain to me the some of the physics of that, or try to as much as he could, and then just kind of talk about the mystery of it all. Like there's still so much, like even today in 2021, that we don't understand about how the meteorology works, how the weather works. We just kind of put it in statistical probabilities. But that was to say, he would talk about the sort of frustration with the mystery of it, that there's still so much that is ununderstandable. And then on the other hand, I would have times with my mom where she would talk about kind of like the just the importance of what we can get from a relationship with God. And so there was that sort of like back and forth with it. And I did spend a lot of time with like my older sister was an influence on me, my grandmother was an influence on me, and they would have, which is kind of weird because it's like 4 generations and then me, or three or four influences anyway. But very different perspectives. And actually, my older sister, she would give me psychological insights from her own study too. Like when I was really young, like I don't know, 7 or 8 years old, I would have a lot of nightmares, and I would go talk to my family about it, and my sister just told me like, "Oh, you've got monsters in your dreams. Just tell them that you don't believe in them." So, which was like a radical shift, and it changed like my psyche forever, because after that, like my dream life, and I know that there's a lot of people even today, or like adults our age or whatever, that will struggle with weird things in their dreams. Sometimes they don't remember it, sometimes it's things from their past or whatever, and they never get that sort of lucid control. And so I just kind of like went for it with that, and then it made my dream life very lucid from a young age, where then I would just like kind of play with the monsters instead of run with them, run from them. So yeah, that's to kind of just, it was a very diverse background of authority. And my dad, by the way, he was what would you call it? There was some conflict, like in many marriages and intimate partnerships. So there were a couple years off and on where he wasn't there. He went to live with his family on the East Coast in Boston. And usually during those times, there would be other, um, not like from my mom, but like from the church, authority figures that would step in. Um, so basically, that is to say, it was kind of like a plethora of authority figures helping to get me through those developmental years. And um, part of the reason why, like, I would say that I'm like the unique individual that I am. So, so there you go.
How old was your older sister in terms of age difference?
Um, let's see, about almost almost 10 years older. I think 9 or 10 years older. I would have to double check. Sometimes it's confusing while all the siblings now have to keep up with all the
Yeah,
nieces and
absolutely.
nephews.
Um, why were your parents blue collar workers?
Hmm. It depends who and when you would ask, I would think, because um, they were both very intelligent. So it's like they could have probably have um, achieved white collar status or something like that. But um, one, it's you have to kind of understand the cultural values of the time, being kind of like very influenced by the 60s and 70s. And I was born in 82, um, which was, kind of like that whole thing was kind of like the response to, a lot of people don't understand that sort of ebb and flow of American culture. So basically, my grandparents' generation, who fought in World War II, partly because of the whole World War situation, and some of them being affected by uh, the Depression, or if not, then their parents, my great grandparents, would have been affected by the Depression. They became, my grandparents' generation were super conservative. And then because of that, the next generation, the boomers, some of them were, kind of like followed in their parents' footsteps, but most of them were kind of like the opposite, kind of like the make love, not war, peace, love, and everything else, which has its value, but not always necessarily in terms of, you know, being involved in the corporate world and being successful in the typical ways. So the culture of that generation, although some of them, like I said, kind of followed in their parents' footsteps, but some of them, like my parents, were more of the rebels, I guess. So that then led them to not be super conservative, although they were in some ways, but then what would you say? To also value like blue collar kind of work ethic, just in the fact that if you just put in an honest day's work, and that's kind of enough. You don't need to necessarily get so highly exalted through your work by being some academic or some millionaire or whatever. But if you just put in an honest day's work, there's a lot of value to that too.
What were your grandparents like? You said your grandmother had a lot of influence over you. Talk to me about your grandparents.
So, yeah, to try to sort of briefly go over that, they all fought in World War II, which was interesting to have that influence because, well, I think my parents were a little young to have gone into Vietnam, but my so like some of the people in my parents' generation were involved in Vietnam or maybe even the Korean War, but to be involved in World War II. You know, sometimes we talk about it, like last week when we were talking about Carl Jung, we even talked a little bit about how he was, you know, there in Europe during World War I and World War II. And, you know, it's pretty mind-blowing to think about how that, like, there were times when it did look like it could have gone the other way in World War II. You know, it could have gone the way where either the other side would have won, at least for a period of time, or even if not, then it could have gone on for years longer. And going on for years longer would, of course, mean a lot more death and all the horrible things with war. So that made them, I would say that it's a little difficult to understand, because, okay, my mother's parents were, well, one of my very first memories, like about 4 years old, maybe, yeah, give or take 4 years old, was actually learning of the death of my grandfather on my mom's side. And one thing with that was that that's part of why that I spent a lot of time with my grandmother, is because I mean, she didn't marry or date or anything after that, but she was kind of like a little bit of a homebody after that, we'll say. And so it was partly like, even though it might just be babysitting or I'm helping her on the house, it was partly unspoken that she just kind of needed the company after that. And actually that kind of really developed a, what would you call it? Just like an ability to when necessary, although I can still develop the skill better, but when necessary, to just let people talk and just listen to people. And it's a little difficult to do on things like Clubhouse, but like I think because my grandmother would just like open up to me, even just like about what it was like in World War II and those kind of cultural situations. And I'm like 7, 8, 9 years old, kind of like, huh? But that whole experience, just going through that, would make it so that I could do that throughout life. And it was kind of like a skill that I took for granted sometimes in life, and probably should develop a little bit more. But that was, so that was my mom's side parents. And then on my dad's side, they lived in the Boston, Massachusetts area, there, at least my whole life. And we would visit almost every summer for most of my childhood, give or take. And my grandmother would try to instill, what would you call it? Kind of those sort of like, you almost have to understand the sort of Massachusetts liberal conservative sort of position, but she would try to instill those kind of values when she could. And then, although my grandfather, he had other kidney conditions, actually, so he was sick a lot when I was young, and then passed away about 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago now. So I that was the thing, is I didn't get to really spend time with my grandfathers, but over the years, I spent a fair amount of time with my grandmothers, and they both had a fair amount of influence on me. And as far as their personality, it's like they were, like I said, that generation, it's just very, they're very big on like one practical thing I could say both of my grandmothers were big on that I probably should have learned more from is, that generation is very big on manners. And like this generation gets no instruction on how to like speak respectfully to authorities, or like or how to like you know set a dinner table or anything like that almost. But they both at least tried to instill that in me, so that was a little different from my parents' generation that were a little bit less conservative, I guess we'll say.
Awesome. Talk to me about your journey. Who were you at 5? Who were you at 15? Who were you at 25? What's your journey of evolution been?
So 15,
5?
5, 15, 25?
Correct.
Okay, so my journey, well, I guess about 5 to, well, I don't know if I think it was in one of your rooms we did recently where I mentioned, I don't know if it was, yeah, about 5 years old when I went to kindergarten. I didn't speak for the first 3 months. Like one word, like I would speak on the way to my mom, my sister, whoever was with me to drop me off or whatever for kindergarten. I think it was kindergarten, yeah. And if not preschool, I don't know. Like those get confusing if it's kindergarten or preschool. But anyway, I was about 5, I think. Yeah, and then I didn't speak for 3 months. I believe it's 3 months or about 3 months of that school year. And of course, it started in the fall, but then in the winter, we would have to, we'd go out and play, and this was where we have all the seasons, so we'd have our coats. And then I came in, like the last one in from recess outside or whatever, and then I had to like hang up my coat, and then I was just like standing there kind of clueless what to do because everybody hung up their coat and there was nowhere to like hang mine, none of the little hooks. And so the teachers or whatever were there just kind of looking at me, and they said, well, hang up your coat and go inside and do the next thing, whatever. And then I just said, well, I would if one of you ladies would tell me where to put it. And so they were kind of okay with that. I don't know if at that time it would have been an acceptable way to speak to a teacher, but they were kind of okay with that. And then after that, I would engage with everyone.
So you literally didn't speak to anybody for 3 months?
Right. At the school. I would fine at home or in the vehicle on the way there. But and I feel like it's kind of that thing. I mean, maybe it's a personality trait more in some people than others, or something. But sometimes, when there's a hard challenge, we just won't go through it. And that's kind of, as a little 5-year-old, like the challenge would be socializing with strangers. And so I do it for a few months. But after that, it was great. I was fine playing with everyone. But the tricky thing after that, sort of unrelated, is my older siblings were having, I don't even know all the details, but they were having, we'll say, difficulty with the school system for some reason. My mom didn't approve of certain things that was happening with my older siblings in the public school system. So she decided to take us out of school after that year. And so basically we were homeschooled, which funnily enough, it roughly takes us 10 years because when I was roughly 15, I would have to double check on some of the details. I was in 10th grade, is when I got into school, like regular school again. And then because I was homeschooled for roughly that, those 9 or 10 years, most of my time in the neighborhood and just in life was actually, if I wasn't like inside learning hooked on phonics or whatever, then I would be like outside in trees or catching frogs, catching fireflies, catching, out and about in nature for most of that 10 years, which kind of gave me a different perspective, even though it wasn't like, it was kind of like a middle-sized city, Cedar Rapids, Iowa, not like a super small town, but definitely not a big town either. But I found all the little areas around to like climb all the trees and catch all the things in the pond and all that for most of those years that I was homeschooled. And then up to about 15 years old when I was like a teenager, very involved in the church, because also in that time, the church, as I became a little older and involved in the church when I grew up, or I mean, became a young, whatever, a teenager, the church kind of became social life. And in that, I also developed the church, the sort of like Pentecostal experience. It's a bit conservative in some ways, but it's, I guess, liberal in the spiritual side of it, and that it's very, it's not the kind where you just sit there and you fold your hands. It's very interactive spiritually, and very like, the kind of thing that people might say, people are going crazy, talking in tongues, and all those kind of things. So that's what I was heavily involved in like deep personal, sometimes hours a day in prayer as a teenager, but also trying to find my independence. And at that time, roughly 15 years old, my mom, this was part of the conflict between my parents, is, my dad wanted me to be in regular school, and my mom said, no, maybe some kind of private school, especially a Christian private school. And I don't know all the details as to why. By this time, we were actually living in Iowa City, which is the university town not far from Cedar Rapids. But basically, the school that they liked was, and maybe it was because I was being a little bit of a unruly teenager, unhappy with some of the things as far as my parents break up, get back together, those kind of things, and things like that, where basically then I ended up going to a private Christian boarding school, which was about an hour north of where I lived at the time, or my family lived. So basically then, during the school year, roughly speaking, I would live at the school in their little dormitories, and then, and to speak to kind of like what that was like, it was interesting because they were very Presbyterian in that they had very strong convictions about certain things in the Bible, which we probably won't get into, but things that my organization would disagree with. And so when I was then there trying to, be acclimated young man and all that, I would be like getting into these theological debates with the teachers and some of the students and everything. And that was my sort of like high school experience, although it was interesting because it would be back and forth between Cedar Rapids, where I was going to church, Iowa City, where my family was, and then the boarding school, and then they would drive around as I was like on the basketball team and soccer team at that time. So it was kind of like an interesting time being back and forth between like all these locations in that area, Iowa and Illinois. But also the school, it was pretty small. There were like between about 15 people per class. Class meaning like English class, history class, but then also like my sophomore, freshman, senior class. Roughly speaking, about 15 people per, and they were a mixture of missionary kids, and they were a mixture of like basically juvenile delinquents, which was basically people who about my age, teenagers back in the late 90s or 2000, but they would be running with the long crew, similar to what my older siblings were doing, and then they would get sent to boarding school to kind of like get their act together. And then the other things in the mix were very serious students from Ethiopia and Korea, mainly South Korea, of course. So it was like and some from a couple other countries. So it was a weird cultural mix, which I really enjoyed that aspect of it. And then basically my best friend at that time, I'm trying to think if I'm like, well, I won't go into the details, but he was in that juvenile delinquent kind of category. Troubled young man trying to get his life together, and basically he did during that time. I felt like I was, and he would agree, that I was a positive influence to help him do so. We were actually sort of roommates in the little high school dorm situation. And so after that, after high school, I spent a year in the Iowa City to go to college, but then I was basically like, I could just see you guys at the holidays like everybody else does in town. So got in a Greyhound bus, moved out to California. And the reason I mentioned my friend who was my roommate in high school is because we then became roommates in college here in Southern California. And then we were very, he and I both were very involved in the church here. And then shortly after that, so like a bigger, so well, I guess medium-sized church, a few hundred people, but then helped start a new church, basically in an area a little bit south, kind of between LA, San Diego, roughly speaking, an area where there was not a church like that. And then that's mainly what I did in my 20s, was involved in that church. I went to a school that was around for a little while here called the Los Angeles College of Ministries, in addition to my regular schooling where I studied business. And so I learned kind of the Pentecostal perspective of sort of like a seminary light, you might say. And that was my 20s, a very spiritual time, but towards the end of that became a very financially focused time. So there you go. The story, 5 years old to through the 20s.
Awesome, awesome. And what's your journey been since, from then to now?
So what that was like is basically the church was great, but starting a new church is very challenging. And we had a certain amount of success. I was very involved in the technical side of things. I was like the sound guy. I was also involved in helping drug addicts get clean. I was involved in, I was actually involved in teaching Sunday school, preaching even a little bit off and on, as I was trained in that for a few years. But excuse me, I was talking about this last night in another room that I was doing, how that it's what I think churches often don't realize is being super conservative has its advantages and disadvantages. And I don't know, the advantages might be obvious, like you're going to, like, if people do the conservative thing, you know, for shorthand, lack of a better word, don't sin as much. There's advantages to that. Excuse me. The disadvantage, and this is kind of where, in the process since then, I learned more about the Jungian shadow, is if you really focus on just purity, just abstinence from unclean things, we'll say for shorthand, it causes repressions if you don't deal with that properly. And there was some of that in my own life, but then also the friends that I would have in that environment, you know, would be, and I'm sure we all know people in maybe in certain religious organizations that, and we can think of people in the history of religious organizations where, because you're super strict in certain areas of purity, then there's repressions, and it leads to, you know, what Carl Jung might call shadow behavior, where you're unconsciously doing impure things. And there wasn't anything like dramatically going on as far as like, you know, nothing too dramatic or traumatic, but it would be like, you know, people secretly, especially being close to Los Angeles, people secretly going up to, and like, that were my friends, and getting me involved here and there, although I never really dealt with drugs myself. There were people like sneaking off to LA, go and get drunk, and then the only way to drive back from LA sober is to like find somebody with cocaine, you know? So that was kind of the difficulty, that there was that element to it, while and then certain parts of the organization, or, you know, they want, for appearances, those kind of things to be kept secret, we'll say, although it wasn't, from like a perspective of other people, it's not that big of a deal. It's like, okay, you went and partied, and maybe it went a little too far because of that's how things go once in a while. But that is to say, that kind of led it to where, without getting into too many of the details, where you know, I wasn't as involved as I thought I would be, and then so instead I got more involved in the financial culture, or the financial businesses, and I had a period of time basically after that, late 20s-ish, when I got married for a few years, and I was focused on being financially successful, and I had managed some properties. I had a financial business that was pretty successful, and we'll just say I was very financially successful for a few years in the world of financial services. Although the tricky thing about that is that industry in particular, the culture within that industry is very Machiavellian, and that if you're not careful, there's a lot of backstabbing going on. And you'll notice that common thread is that, like, it's like, what do we do with that shadow element? If we feel betrayed from a religious organization, and then from business partners, like, what do we do with that? And then at the same time, going through my divorce, and then a rebound relationship, and then another rebound relationship, kind of like, and then my friend that I was very involved in the church with, about 3 years ago now, passed away from cancer, colon cancer, at the same time as going through all of that, giving up my business, giving up my romantic relationships, we'll say, at the time. And that kind of led me into a little bit of, like, what psychologically or Jung might call the night sea journey, or you might just call my sort of mid to late 30s midlife crisis, where I turned it into a deep spiritual experience for me, where basically I would be, like, for about the last 3-ish years, just pouring myself into seeing what answers I could find in books that I haven't bothered to read before, trying to understand the mind, trying to understand culture. And in so doing, I feel like that's what I kind of got those answers. It took, like, a lot of deep study, and I think the reason isn't because it's super, super complicated. It's because like I said, kind of at the opening of this, the answers are often, like, right in front of our face, but we just don't want to deal with them. Like, in relationships, a lot of times, whether it's a ministry relationship, a business relationship, a romantic relationship, a friendship, sometimes we think everything's going great if there's no like, quote unquote conflict for a long time. But really what's going on is we're avoiding conflict. And if we confront little conflicts, then it won't turn into big conflicts that will cause big issues later on. So that's one of the main things that I learned from that experience, which kind of gets us to the last year or two, where I started, since I was reading, like, hundreds of books a year for the last 3 years, roughly speaking, and I wanted people to talk to about that. That's when I started Facebook groups and then the podcast a little over a year ago, to engage in dialogue. And then a few months ago, when I found Clubhouse, then that helped too, to engage in dialogue with people about these sort of deep, interesting things that I'd been studying. And then that brings us to where we're at today.
Awesome.
So there you go. Yeah.
Awesome. So what would you describe have been your tragedies? What have been the difficulties, the challenges that have shaped your identity that you want to share?
I would say, sort of briefly for those, is one, it was dealing with the sort of conflict in my home growing up, as far as uh, my dad there off and on. And then I felt like at the time, and then also with my older siblings going through a lot of uh, issues, we'll say, for the sake of time. And then I felt like, and at the time, like, I mean, my older brother, who almost died a bunch of times, like hit by a car head on 2 or 3 times, and I still believe that he only survived some of those uh, violent incidents, and my other older brother had some similar things happen. And I do really believe, like, it's empirically evident to me that they'd only survived some of those situations because I mean, they were like basically and they try to kill each other once or twice. But they were basically, you know, took their, they took their life like they didn't really care if they lived or died for a period of time. That led to that. But then what I was saying is, empirically, to me, they are only alive, and of course, they still are to this point, but a little damaged from all that, because of the prayers of my mom. It's just weird that they're alive, all that they went through physically, and I'd been through, I don't know if I would call them necessarily near-death experiences, but at least one or two where I felt like life could have, I could have died once or twice, but I didn't. One that comes to mind is in a sort of random rock climbing adventure that I did unprotected, or without ropes, and I definitely could have fallen, and I really did feel like there was something holding me. And but I say that to say that even though those situations for me were sort of, and then also at about that same time when I was a teenager, my probably best friend at that time, childhood best friend, who was also my cousin, passed away in a farming accident. And the really weird thing that I find from that event, even up to how the world responded to like celebrity deaths of like Kobe and some others that have unfortunately passed away recently. One weird thing in our culture now, whether a family is very involved in religion or not, or whatever the culture might be, at least in the Western culture, like, we're basically clueless when it comes to how to process and deal with grief and loss. And so there was those events when I was roughly a teenager, and then also the loss of my mother when I was 29, I think 28 or 29, in 2009, and she had breast cancer, which was also very difficult because it's weird, because I was talking to actually a Clubhouse group last week about how certain people who had certain mindsets, not even getting into prayer studies, because there's been scientific studies on prayer where certain people, including with breast cancer like my mom had, and with other types of cancer and diseases, they would have a higher rate of survival and less pain based on their mindset or spiritual life. But that's only a statistical probability. So it didn't work out for my mom, and that was difficult to process. That sort of my rebound to that a few months later was to get into the relationship that became my wife for a few years. if I could say why that didn't work out, it would be kind of like because of, like I talked about a few minutes ago, how things seem to be going great often because it's like, oh, we haven't had a fight for a few months or a year or two, but what people usually need to do is confront those little conflicts, even if it might be a little conflict about the dishes or, you know, whatever. We have to confront those little conflicts or they get bigger and bigger. And then that combined with, when that didn't work out, I tried some rebound relationships. Well, one in particular, I mean, there's only one serious rebound relationship after my divorce, which I felt like I was very in love with that, but for a lot of reasons, or one or two reasons, it didn't work out. But that kind of fell apart at the same time as I lost my friend who we had talked about. That was basically one of my best friends for like 15 years through colon cancer. And that was all when I was like, what, 36, I guess, 36 or 30, yeah, 36. Which was interesting because it lined up in that time where, you know, it's just like you question everything, at least for me. And then because of, well, and I list them all out that way actually for a reason. It's because I think, as I've talked to people over the years, that's sort of common, where you have a number of traumatic type things, we'll say, like that. And the most common thing that most people do is they just get busy with something else, like get a new job that keeps the person busy, get a new something to keep a person busy with, it, whether it's a job or a relationship or something else. And so for the most part, that's what I did. Either got super busy with my career, my relationship, or spirituality. And I don't think I would say I was average educated up to that point, give or take, whatever that means. But I felt like 3 years ago, I was naive in some areas. And so that's why when I got into a lot of the areas that we've been talking about, rather than just be involved in it and like just for the goal of spirituality or just for the goal of financial success, I wanted to like really, really understand things. And that's why when I got involved in my own sort of study the last few years, like it would be like around the clock, meditatively studying, like I said, constantly to get to some of these kind of understandings that we talked about. And again, that brings us back up to where we are today. So
Awesome.
yeah.
So who are you right now? Who is Isaac? What is your identity?
You know, I would say the last couple of years when I was going through that journey that we just talked about, I was really trying to get the most out of that, like the most out of like, I could just like go get super busy again with a new career type thing, or get super busy again with a new romantic relationship. And I did some work and some whatever relationships and this and that, but I was more like, and we even talked about this a little bit in some of the rooms that we had, I think last week, where it's like people in history, even not just Jung, but also Freud, used that opportunity in life where they kind of went through a little bit of a midlife crisis to get the most out of those situations. So that's really what I've been doing. And I think if COVID didn't happen, maybe, you know, when it did a year and a half ago or whatever, then I probably I would be trying to finish either a degree or a master's degree in psychology right now. to kind of take my career more specifically in that direction. But because the distractions of COVID happened, and I kind of look at what happened with COVID as kind of like the whole world going through a similar crisis to what I had been going through the previous couple of years. And so I'd use that a little more as an opportunity to dig down on that and learn from that experience, almost similar to what I'd learned from my grandmothers about going through World War II. I know it's not totally analogous, but this whole pandemic situation has been very informative, I guess we'll say. Like it like opens up the hood of the collective psyche, or like the culture. Like normally, like in 2019, everybody could just be like, this is the world and everything's great. But I mean, of course, COVID is horrible. I'm not a denier of it, but it's kind of mind-blowing that we're like, the global culture is weak, not just to viruses, but weak to challenge that. I don't think that the culture handled the whole situation very well. I mean, not maybe we couldn't handle it very well, and it's maybe super complicated. But long story short, I've been learning from that. And to answer your question, I would just say that I'm in transition to have my career more in the psychological world, and in the past, I feel like, yeah, I would have those challenges with the spiritual community or the financial community that I was involved in the past. But also, after a while, I kind of got bored with those. Whereas I feel like in the psychological world, I don't feel like I'll really get bored with it. It may have its ups and downs, but because it's so infinite and makes things make so much more sense, it's not something I'll get bored with. So, yeah, I'm transitioning into a psychological type career, but I say it that way too, just because I'm a little bit undecided if that I want to just like be in something clinical, or I would kind of rather, and this is kind of like maybe why I put off some of those things, because I would kind of rather do something new and unique that I haven't really maybe entirely figured out yet. And that's maybe kind of what I've been doing for the last year or two, is figuring out because there's so much in the psychological world, self-help world, spiritual world, but it seems like there's something missing. And I feel like your group is kind of doing that too, trying to find out like what's missing and all that. And that's kind of like what I'm trying to find out, is not just like be another one of the things that are already there, but fill in the gap for some things that are missing in those communities. So there you go.
Awesome. Let's go a little bit deeper.
Okay.
Do you believe life has meaning?
Yeah, I believe we can't avoid the answer. Like the answer is yes for everyone to that question, even if they deny it. And if a person denies that life has meaning, what they're doing is they're just they're getting into a life of suffering, and suffering has meaning. They're just not going to recognize it right away. So yeah, life has meaning for everyone.
If life has meaning, that means you're ascribing an intelligent universe.
Yes, but the tricky thing with that is the world's going to always look intelligent because we're intelligent. and we can't get out of our perspective as intelligent human conscious creatures, whatever you want to call us, human beings. I forget I don't know if I'm trying to remember a particular quote, but it's like if the cows had a god, the god to the cows would look like a cow. And there's a quote like that I'm sort of paraphrasing. But the idea is that because we're intelligent, the universe is going to look intelligent. And it may very well be, and I believe it is, but we just don't know to what degree that's exactly right. But I will say what I personally believe, however empirical or not it may be, is that in reality, it's actually something more intelligent than intelligence the way that we understand it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So you believe that the universe is intentional, it's intelligent, that there is meaning to life. If you believe in an intelligent and intentional universe, you also believe that the universe is non-random. If you believe that the universe is non-random, then anything that's non-random is by design. So the question is, what is the design for the human being?
There's Ian McGilchrist. I talked about it, I think, a little bit last night. I was in a couple rooms last night, including yours, one of yours, for a long time. So I forget if I mentioned it in your room. But Ian McGilchrist he put out a few years ago, or 10 years ago now, The Master's Emissary. And then he's got another book coming out now called The Matter of Things later this year. And he released where he's reading the introduction to that book, The Matter of Things. And I highly recommend that, even though I think on YouTube you can only hear like 30 or something minutes of it. But he makes a couple points to what you were just saying, that as far as randomness, that's only things can, long story short, things can look random from certain perspectives, but from other perspective, like I was saying a couple minutes ago, it seems to have something, an order to things, be like above just simple what is intelligent. The ordering principles in the universe are more than just intentional and purposeful and intelligent, and all those things. So it is those things that you mentioned, and I forget because you mentioned like 2 or 3 of them. But like I said too, it's our access to what that is. I think everyone has to admit on some level, it's very limited. But this is where my somewhat controversial pragmatism philosophy comes in, but I think it's the opposite of that, is that even though we have very limited access to the information that is reality, the information that is the universe, multiverse, whatever that it might be, we have more than enough for our journey in life, whether that we want to call that the individuation process to wholeness, whether we want to call that the hero's journey, whether we want to call that enlightenment, salvation, whatever the case is, we have more than enough understanding and information. So that's my take on it.
So the question is, what are we designed for?
What do we? Well, part of that is because we're the only known, we're the only entities that we know of that have the level of awareness, especially self-awareness like we have. Part of our design, whether you want to say that's of the universe or of God or whatever the case, and although I do talk about the universe having a Darwinian nature, I never ever see this like I don't know if like I think Eric in the room last night, I don't know if he was saying he thought I was an atheist or that was just like his thing off the top of his head off of like some limited conversation that we had, you know, but he was just saying, for example, me as an atheist. And sometimes I think people misunderstand because I talk about Darwinian evolution a fair amount, that I must be an atheist, but I never see a conflict there. The way that I see it, there can be a God that, or an intelligent design to reality, the universe, whatever, and that can work through the complexity, including evolution, that put us here. So I don't see a conflict. And in that, we have become aware of such things, including how it seems that we got here and how it seems that we have this consciousness. And to answer your question, one purpose of ours is to answer that question, which I don't think we have total access to. So part of our purpose is to find purpose for ourselves as individuals, ourselves as a species, and ourselves as part of the complex universe. And that process is has an indefinite beginning and an indefinite end. So we're not going to completely have the answer to it in our lifetime, but everyone has to work towards having a better understanding of their purpose in the universe and that of how that they can help the community and consciousness as such, we'll say. So there you go.
What's your purpose, Isaac? What is your hero's journey?
I would say, similar to what I was saying in the last few minutes, is that it is to find it for myself, and in the process to help others do the same, and not just help others do the same, but help others to do the same, and to help make reality make more sense. Because, I mean, just like some of the things that we've talked about in this time, you know, for some people, you know, and it can drive a person crazy. It can make them lose it. But you know, when I first started going through some of these crises, we'll say, that had built up over time, that I finally dealt with in the last 3 years ish, you know, maybe I should have been in therapy. You know, I mean, it wasn't like being hurtful or damaging, but I was pretty broken. And this is why maybe I say that I'm hesitant to just get in like something clinical as far as my hopefully final career shift, is because at that time, like if I were to try to verbalize, like go to a therapist or whatever and say, hey, let's therapy and, you know, talk through this or whatever, I wasn't able to. Like if I was so broken at that time, about 3 years ago, with just like the weight of 2 or 3 or 4 things happening at once, and having to deal with some things that I put off dealing with, uh, that, yeah, I could function and I probably wouldn't do anything dangerous or whatever, but um, it wasn't anything that I could verbalize at the time at all. Like, yeah, we'd gone through a lot of complex stories and journeys here in the call that we've had, but like, there'd be no chance I could get through any of that 2 or 3 years ago. So anyway, I say that to say my purpose that I'm trying to find is to help others make those journeys that could crush a person sometimes, but also I also want to look at things from a positive perspective too, not just like when people go through traumatic or dramatic sort of times in life and to not lose their mind. That's definitely a goal, but also the positive aspect to it that, you know, we're in a time in history that's very, has some crises going on that we talked about, but also it has maybe more opportunity than ever at the same time. Because like what I went through in the last couple of years, just learning from hundreds and hundreds of books and all those things, I probably wouldn't have been able to do in any other point in history. I mean, maybe just a few years prior, but prior to the internet and the mass availability of books and everything else, I don't know what would have happened. It's like books may have saved my life and my mind because, and like sometimes I talk about, even like we mentioned a few times in our clubhouse rooms, how it's like I really get into audiobooks, but for me, at least when I have the opportunity, it's like that isn't just like a convenience. It's like a meditation, and to go through these things in a meditative way is transformative in ways that I think more people need to engage in. And so my purpose might be to help others overcome those difficulties, but also the positive side, just to that I feel like learning can be deeper than it's been ever in the past. Like if people engage with not just technology, yes, but also just because we have such an opportunity of having, like, we never had so many readily access to not just books and audiobooks, like I talked about a little bit, but also you know, communities like we're involved in on Clubhouse and social media, where, you know, talking to somebody like you and talking to some people like we've talked to in our Clubhouse rooms and on social media, that never would have happened even just like 10 years ago, or you know, give or take. So this is kind of why I say it's complicated, because I am a little bit of a, I don't know, I'm kind of like, I see so much opportunity now, not just like to maybe find a cool new career that I haven't completely figured out yet, but also it's a interesting time in history where we can put together so many technologies and so many communities that, you know, even if we don't necessarily evolve or transcend or become more enlightened, like the culture can become more of a growth culture. And so I guess to answer your question, my purpose would be to help the culture that I'm involved in to become more of a growth and wholeness and individuation type of a culture.
So a teacher of a sort, maybe an author, maybe a book writer, maybe a podcast host.
Yeah, all of those things: teacher, author, podcast host, and
a communicator of ideas.
Right. And yeah, that's a good way to summarize it. Yeah.
You said that the meaning of life is to discover the purpose of life. How does that support an intelligent universe? Why would an intelligent universe create human beings with the mission of discovering their mission?
Well, I mentioned this a little bit in some of the rooms that we did, but I believe that so much of what reality has for us, whatever we want to call that, is less about the things, objects and subjects like me and you and individuals and even physical objects and books, but it's more about the betweenness and the betweenness between individuals and the betweenness between God or the universe, whatever a person might want to call it. And so to answer your question, that making that at least part of the purpose or part of our mission or part of our journey of life is, one, it makes those who take on that journey better and stronger. And then two, if there's something like an end goal or an end game or an end result or something like that, it's, and I don't necessarily mean this in a biblical way. Jordan Peterson mentioned it and some others that are not officially biblical. But the end result is the kingdom of God, and the kingdom of God is within. And so what that means is the kingdom of God, and again, not necessarily in a strictly biblical way or even a strictly religious way, but the kingdom of God is that people are striving towards being the best individual that they can be, and as that they do so, then within them is that connection to each other and the universe, the intelligent designer, God, whatever you want to call it. And so that sort of order of becoming more divine, for lack of a better word, is built into reality. And that, and so part of, and also to answer your question, and even the way that I've tried to already, is that, you know, if we think we just have the meaning, then we lose it, which is a little bit of a Eastern perspective, actually, that says, you know, like the Tao that can be named is not the Tao. And I think it's the same thing, and that's where sometimes we get it wrong in the West, that if we say we've totally got it figured out, like this is the mission, this is the savior, whatever, then it kind of like slips through our hands. But if we say we know it's something like this, and because we can only hold a little bit of that information, we keep building on it, then we're on the right track. But as soon as you say, I've got it figured out, you lose it, because that leads to other psychological traps. So yeah, that's the answer.
What does the word surrender mean to you?
Well, to me, what comes to mind is it's synonymous with yielding. And the reason I say that is because what I think of is that for lack of a better word, universe, reality, implicate order to consciousness, whatever we want to call it, it has all the purpose that we need and all the information that we need, and all we have to do is kind of go with that. And so when we do just go with the implicate order within reality and the universe, etc., then we've got all that we need right there. It's like constantly right in front of us, but it's just that our sort of left brain ego mindset doesn't want to do that. It's sort of like an evolutionary, I don't know if it's a feature or a bug, but if we it's that our separated consciousness in our verbal mind, and this is again sort of like master's emissary perspective from Nietzsche and Ian McGilchrist, that we think like our conscious verbal mind is this, like, has all the answers and has everything figured out and all that, but that's like less than 1% of what's going on. What's going on is in the nonverbal right hemisphere, which is connected to the whole reality as such. And if we yield to that, then we've got all of our purpose and all of our answers right there. We just don't really know how to verbalize it very well. So that's what it means to me.
What are your practices of surrender?
My practices of surrender are to, one, just always pay attention and always challenge when I don't, is first of all, because I don't always when I should. And, like we were talking last night in a room about values, and one thing that I think we didn't get to, but it's really important, is, like we see on the back of the dollar bill in America, and we see in the Egyptian traditions, that has, the eye on the top of the pyramid, which is to represent the highest value. And, we won't necessarily go into that discussion again, maybe until tomorrow when we have a room on it, but it's actually to pay attention, because we don't always know, like, what is true, what is loving, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes we don't surrender when we know we should surrender, but we want to pay attention to what happens in those cases. So one of the biggest ones is to pay attention. And then the other is, as far as like practical practices, is to just always carve out time to make educating myself a meditative practice, and because like there's two ways to like gain information. I mean, or I guess what I would call is the main way that people will like go through a book or try to learn something is to just be like, give me all the information, like here's all the facts, I'm gonna like memorize them and try to do something with it. Like that's the way that like our education system kind of makes us learn often, at least generally speaking, is just memorize a bunch of facts and try to apply it towards a career or test or whatever. But if a person, including myself, to answer your question, makes like really wrestles with the information, really meditates on it, really makes it a meditative, grappling, gripping process, one, there's growth there, but then also one of the things I try to do isn't just like, I try to avoid when I'm studying, learning, whatever, I really try to avoid things that are like confirmation bias. And I will try as much as I can to seek out opposing views, especially ones that are well put together, like Sam Harris is one example. I've gone through a lot of his books and podcasts and everything. Maybe Stephen Peaker, some of these Enlightenment rationalists that sort of make atheism and rationalism their God. And so I really try to understand the opposite perspective and yielding to that and surrendering to that sort of, because, and I mention all that because I think generally speaking, and this might have been me years ago, if there's someone who has an opposite view of myself or people in general, we want to just be like, oh, they're stupid, they're crazy, they have some weird ideology that has blinded them to the truth, those kind of things, which may be true to a large extent, but if you, really try to understand their perspective, what we usually see is they're roughly the same as other serious thinking individuals. The only difference is they've chosen a different filter to use for their life. Anyway, those are some of my surrendering practices.
Awesome. What do you know about Islam?
I will say so Christianity, Eastern religions, and Judaism. Of the five major religions, I would confess that I know the least of Islam, although I have read some of the history of it and some of the Quran, and talked to some of the some people who practice. But I would say of the major religions in the world, I would confess I know the least. But I do know the basics just from studying some of the history of Muhammad and the history of how the religion was founded and some of the basics of it. So just the basics, I would say, to answer your question.
Why is that?
It's hard to say if there's one reason, but I would say it's on my something like my bucket list to get to. But you can spend a lifetime studying Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and their different sects within, or their different branches, and then of course Christianity and New Age, whatever.
Right, but you speak of the in-between, right?
Right.
So what is the in-between telling you about why you haven't pursued Islam as a higher priority?
Yeah, I guess I'm just saying that I don't have any particular bias against it. It's sort of that I haven't gotten to it. Like I've gotten to better understand. So like my best friend that I talked about a little bit from high school and college, his family was half from Taiwan and Buddhist. My wife, my now ex-wife, and my serious ex-girlfriend had Buddhist families. When I was married, I went to a Buddhist temple off and on, just to learn, but also for the sake of family, whatever. And so some of that understanding of the Eastern just kind of came by assimilation from my own personal culture and influences. And so, and the other thing too is some of what I had studied in Carl Jung, in Jordan Peterson, and a few others, even Joseph Campbell, they talk about Eastern religions, but they just get a little bit into the Muslim religion. If they did, then I would probably be more interested. Anyway, it's kind of just a thing that I haven't gotten to yet, and I don't think that there's not a particularly good reason that I consciously know of, I guess, to answer your question.
How do you relate to what you do know of it?
How do I relate to what I do know of it? It is, I've tried to, okay, so the way that I study and the way that I try to um, gain knowledge of a religion, of an ideology, or whatever, is it it works best for me at least, and maybe it's a bias or something like that, is if I'm, pursuing other or in general curiosity in a subject and that type of thing. And I've done that a little bit with Islam. Like I said, some of the history. One of the series that I'd recommend is, what's his name? I'd have to double check, but there's some long histories that tell the history of religion and philosophy and some world history from a more narrative perspective. And one thing that I do know is that it has, at least from my understanding, and I may be wrong, but it has a history roughly as old as the Judaic religions, at least in the stories, that it goes all the way back to Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael. And in so doing, there was that split that went, roughly speaking, that far back. And so that's pretty interesting to me, that there's always been this split. And I think it represents, to me, the way that I've understood it, and again, it could be my wrong filter or whatever, is, these splits in culture, like just like the split between the other religions, is that we need it may be better if, hypothetically, if we had sort of like a unified ideology, but that might be completely wrong. The world may be a better place the way that we have it. And of course, there's some negative things that have come from the conflict of religions over the millennia that everyone knows about. But the conflict between Judaism, Christianity, the Muslim traditions, and the others, although it has its violent history, we'll say, and not just violent, but also idea violent, we'll say, that may be the right thing, or it may be the thing that ideologies need to compete with each other, and sometimes it may have unfortunate, unforeseen consequences. But to sort of this betweenness idea, and to try to get at your question, is we probably need a diversity of religions and a diversity of worldviews and a diversity of ideologies in the world. So a lot of people are trying to change things, like, oh, we need to be all Christian, all Muslim, all Eastern religion, whatever the case. I think it's actually good the way it is. That we need the diversity of competing ideologies in the world, and what that teaches us. And yes, there's negative things, we'll say, in the past of religious conflict, but that teaches us how to, better go through our conflicts as individuals, families, nations, and everything else. So I don't know if that helps get at the question, but that's generally my take on it.
What happens to us when we die?
I would say that there is inherently an unknowability to that, but any and all of the um, presented possibilities from the major philosophies and religions to some degree could be right, but those could be just intuitive descriptions. Um, I would say, to try to answer the question, I believe consciousness goes on. We just don't know the details of what that's like. To say that we're like, go to heaven or be one in the universe or go to some other place, may be right, maybe not, but it's probably something like that. We just don't really know how to describe the details. So something would happen, but like if we become one with the universe, so to speak, or go to heaven or whatever the case, or something else, that may be exactly right, but I don't think we would exactly know how to truly put that into words, even if we did know exactly what that answer was. So, but I think that's actually the way that it should be, because there should be a unknowability, maybe a belief, maybe a faith aspect to our relationship with the unknown. I think things would be messed up, and I don't know if that's the best word to use, but things would be like, if we talk about intelligent design, there's the unknowability to things is a feature, not a bug, in the intelligent design. And so the fact that we can't know for sure what'll happen at that point is definitely a good feature, because that gives us a visceral relationship with the unknown, that at any moment anyone could leave this earth and we don't know what would happen after that. It could be heaven, it could be maybe even hell, maybe some other version of continuing consciousness, maybe even some multiverse type of thing. We can't really say for sure, but I believe that the unknowability to it is good for us. That we have to always have a relationship with the unknown, but yeah.
So let's jump out of the deep. A couple of short questions for you.
Okay.
Are you an introvert or an extrovert?
I'm an introvert, but I also enjoy. I'm an ENTP, and ENTPs enjoy certain kinds of social activity, but get more of their regenerative energy from being alone, being with books, being in a spiritual situation, that type of thing.
Are you an idealist or a realist?
The most honest answer I can give to that is I'm a possibilist. I was in, I think, a different room last night, and I went into more detail of that, and I think you can kind of tell from some of the things that I said, is that the world, even right now, and it's always kind of been this way, but I think more over time, and especially in this time, puts both options constantly before us, where constantly we could choose a path where we become weak and become kind of useless to ourselves and all those other things, or we could choose a path where we, like almost anyone, there's of course some marginal exceptions, but the vast majority of people could choose a path at any time that leads them to individuation and wholeness and something like salvation or enlightenment, whatever that they might find their path to be. So that's why, to me, it's kind of both. It's realist in that both those possibilities are before anybody, but it's idealist in that there's infinitely good, renewing, refreshing, restoring opportunities before anybody at almost any time. So both, but possibilist is the word that I like.
Emotional or rational?
I would say that I am emotion. I'm mostly intuitive, so and which is probably the best word for intuition might actually be instinct, which is more linked to feeling or emotion. So I would say that I'm emotional, but I have to, because of all the things that come with it and the responsibility or whatever, I have to rationalize my emotions. So I come across as rational, but I'm actually more instinctive or feelings based.
Are you someone that likes to decide or be decided for?
Well, I would say I like to decide for the quote unquote universe slash God slash intelligent whatever to decide for me. So, but what that is to say is I don't like human authorities to decide for me, generally speaking, although that generally happens anyway, a lot of times, even if that's like God or intelligent design working through them. But so decide, but also I have to recognize when I have to be decided for, which is probably most of the time.
And are you an intellectual or practical?
Sorry I'm so complicated, but I would say that I'm a practical intellectual only because my main philosophy is actually from the what's his name? William James, who's mainly who was one of the main influence on some of the others like Jordan Peterson, Carl Jung, etc. But his main philosophy, William James, was the philosophical school of American pragmatism, which we talked about a little bit today and yesterday, which is that we live in a pragmatic paradigm whether we like it or not. So practical.
Do you prefer? Do you see yourself as a risk taker or risk averse?
A risk taker. A risk taker, but I try to pay attention so I learn from when those don't go the way that they should. So a risk taker, although I will admit that sometimes I will avoid conflict or uncomfortable situations like most people, but I do enjoy risky behavior, maybe to my detriment at some times.
Do you prefer certainty or uncertainty?
I believe the nature of reality is uncertainty, and we don't really get a choice in that, but we have to try to give it some uncertainty, and I can't really argue with reality, and I've learned to enjoy that aspect to it. So I enjoy the uncertainty to reality.
If you were an animal, what kind of animal would you describe yourself as?
A monkey dog. I don't know, something very curious, and I say monkey because I often a lot of my fondest memories growing up are just being in nature, in trees, that type of thing. Also very loyal and very curious and trying to attain wisdom, like Rafiki on on The Lion King. So monkey if I have to pick one.
Awesome. And so what would you say those top 3 qualities of a monkey are that you possess?
Curiosity to attain wisdom to build a better community. So that's kind of like squeezing three things into one, but there you go.
Awesome. So curiosity, wisdom, and community.
Yeah, those three things kind of interchanging with each other, but yeah.
Awesome. So Isaac, I want to thank you so much for hanging out with me.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you
for
for
the deep
sharing your story.
questions.
No problem. Thanks for sharing the story. Thanks for sharing your wisdom. I want to thank the audience for hanging out with us and sharing this space as well.
Yeah.
And I'm going to leave the final message with you. What's your final message to end the show with, brother?
I guess my final message would just be that life, even though it has its weird ups and downs, like Hazel, who's a good friend of mine from Clubhouse, just said hi here. And I know that she and some other people that I met through this adventure the last couple of years has been through some, we'll just say, big adventures, but also very challenging. And my main message is that life is an adventure and enjoy the adventure.
Awesome, brother. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you and have a good one. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.